organized by State Climate Change Cell, Mizoram Science, Technology and Innovation Council, MISTIC, under Directorate of Science and Technology, Government of Mizoram. First, I would like to give a brief introduction to the Mizoram State Climate Change Cell. The Mizoram State Climate Change Cell was established in the year 2014 by the Climate Change Program, CCP, Divisions of Department of Science and Technology, Government of India, under the Mizoram Science, Technology and Innovation Council, Directorate of Science and Technology, Government of Mizoram. The State Climate Change Cell has completed its first phase of the project in 2020, and second phase of the project was started in the year 2021, that is last year. Like all the other 11 state climate change cells in the Indian Himalayan region state of India, the Mizoram State Climate Change Cell was established through the National Mission for Sustaining the Himalayan Ecosystem, NMSHE, of the India's National Action Plans on Climate Change, NAPCC. The State Climate Change Cell, therefore, concentrates in implementations of its own project objective whilst meeting the requirement of the mission's objective of the NMSHE. Simultaneously, the Mizoram State Climate Change Cell has been given the responsibility of the leading role by Government of Mizoram to implement the implement the mission's objective of the strategic knowledge mission under the Mizoram State Action Plans on Climate Change. In this regard, the Mizoram State Climate Change Cell, as one of its key activities among different mandates, has been working towards building the capacities of different stakeholders within the state by analyzing their respective needs and gaps in terms of knowledge and technical capacities. Today's program is also one of the initiatives to address such issues. In the state of Mizoram, since the establishment of Mizoram University and Science Department in different colleges, the advancements of knowledge and research qualities have been increased significantly. Countless research articles, books, patent, discovery of new species has been published by our scholars from time to time. In the field of wildlife research also, I am aware that many of our participants here are experts to the subjects, and they also have outstanding contributions. We, the State Climate Change Cell, by organizing this program, do not imply that they have limited knowledge and need to be taught. We do not even have the slightest capacity to do so. Instead, we are trying to invite our researchers to widen their area of research and move towards understanding the science of climate change, impacts and risks associated with their current area of research. At the same time, we also like to sensitize our aspiring students to build their interest in climate change research as well. I hope that this program will be mind-opening, interactive, and fruitful for the participant. I am confident that our resource persons here today are capable and willing to be sharing us important information and new knowledge to us. I therefore sincerely invite our participants to be attentive and interactive to have a successful program. I wish you all good luck. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir, for the welcome address. And on his behalf, I would like to say that our Chief Scientific Officer Member Secretary has another meeting to attend, so he might not be able to stay for the entire program. So today, for our first speaker, we have with us Dr. David Bickford. He has a PhD in biology and is currently working as a professor associate at National Taiwan University. He studies evolutionary ecology and conservation of biodiversity. So I would now like to request Dr. David Bickford to give his presentation. Over to you, sir.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. Give me a second to find out how to share my screen. Hopefully it will come up pretty soon. There we go. Click on. Oh, it says not able to record the contents until it is quit. Oh no. I might have to, oh, hang on. Let me, sorry, I thought this would be easy. Okay. Okay, good. All right, thank you very much. Without further ado, did that work? Yay, okay. Share. It's still, okay, they can now see my screen, good. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, excellent. All right, let me minimize that. All right, so it really is a pleasure to be able to speak with you today about some of the things that have come to light. I've been studying climate change for a long time, 20 years maybe, before it was popular. Let's just say it that way. And so what we discovered in the course of some of the studies that we started to do was that things are very different sometimes than what we expected. Maybe we can mute some of the other folks. Thank you. In regards to what I'll be focusing on towards the latter part of the presentation, I think it'll be towards more what was asked of me, and that's the kinds of things that we need to be studying, and maybe the ways that we can change the way some of the things that we think about how climate change affects, especially biodiversity. There we go. So we all know about human-induced climate change. Yes, it is anthropogenic, and it's a major threat for both biodiversity and humans. We know that it affects the primary abiotic determinants of biodiversity: temperature, the thermal ecology of all species on the planet, ultraviolet, the radiation that's coming in, more so now than previously, prior to all the greenhouse gases, especially at higher elevations. And then really important for a lot of organisms is the limiting factor of moisture or precipitation. So we know that biodiversity is sensitive to fluctuations in all these things. Some organisms more or less adapted to extreme events. And really that's one of the highlights that I'm going to be talking about a little bit later, is it's not the average across a yearly or month to month even kind of a time frame, but really what's more important is these extreme events that happen. The longer the drought periods, the hotter the periods of high temperatures, those kinds of things, even more intense storms and flooding events. So even though the average is the same, the extremes are really what's going to impact a lot of human populations and biological diversity. In a paper that we did a few years ago now, laying out frameworks of how to assess different species vulnerability to climate change, we took kind of a new approach, laying out some of the abiotic pressures that you're all familiar with, along with the biotic pressures. And we didn't put evolution in this because of the time frames that we're all dealing with. Clearly, only bacteria and maybe some fungi, if we're lucky, are going to be able to evolutionarily respond to the things that are happening in the environment due to impacts of climate change. So we just highlighted the ecological aspects of the biotic change. And then, of course, how these things interact and how humans do things like manage different kinds of protected areas or land use, or the ways that we extract or use certain kinds of resources from the environment. They can interact, and that's what this hub in the middle is really all about, is that interaction. These are not independent. They're all highly interactive. And the more we learn about those interactions, I think the greater our chance to actually mitigate some of the negative impacts. So later on in the talk, I'm going to come back to some of these ideas about what species we choose to study, the ecosystems we choose to study them in, and more importantly, how they interact with people, or how people interact or manage those species and ecosystems becomes really the crux of what we're going to be talking about. And I think what your government and a lot of your scientists need to really focus in on as well. So I know you guys all know all this. Temperature is going to get warmer with very high certainty. It's already happening. Precipitation is the thing I think that's more variable and has greater uncertainty. So we know that some wet places will get wetter, some dry places will get drier, but many places, again, the average is going to stay the same. It's these extreme events that are going to be driving a lot of the negative impacts, especially with climate change. And I don't want to focus too much or all on just the negative impacts, because certainly subspecies are going to do better, right? There are going to be positive impacts, the expansion of ranges of many species, for example. You could consider that to be a negative in the fact that they could become invasive in habitats they hadn't previously been in. But if they're following their ecological niche and it's an evolutionary kind of trajectory, then I think that taking away the definition of an invasive species becomes pretty important as well. Almost all ecosystems are being impacted, and the ways that they're being impacted are basically across these two really important abiotic kind of measures. We already know that this is happening, right? There's been a raft of research out there. We know back in the early 2000s, a lot of people, especially working on organisms like what I study, amphibians and reptiles, were already predicting up to a third of all species were going to be highly vulnerable to changes that were brought upon by climate change. And these changes were going to be leading to their higher vulnerability of going extinct. And this, of course, wasn't going to be in a short time frame. This was going to be over many generations for these organisms. But in the case of lizards, this really influential paper in 2004, huge biodiversity loss already accruing in some groups like ectotherms, like reptiles and amphibians that we've already seen. So early predictions, unfortunately, have come true in many places. Hopefully not as much in India, but I guess time will tell. And part of the reason for these really strong negative impacts and the high degree of vulnerability to extinction are the fact that many people didn't think about the actual aspects of thermal biology between tropical organisms or higher latitude or temperate organisms. Being at, in this case, what we're looking at is a couple of relative fitness charts and then temperature changes. So the current temperature range of species is in gray for both the tropical and the temperate zone. And then the predicted temperature shift due to climate change, due to anthropogenic climate change, is happening in red. And you can see what happens is as fitness goes up, right, that's a good thing for a species. You want to reproduce more, you want to have your offspring survive. So you want to be approaching these kinds of top relative fitness parts of the chart. But what you don't want to do is exceed when that comes back down, when your thermal limit has been reached. You don't want to exceed that. And what's happening in the tropics more than the temperate zone is that many species are already at or very close to their thermal limits. So climate change is going to push them over those thermal limits and create whole populations and maybe even entire species that will be extirpated or go extinct because of their inability to survive in that thermal niche that they're so well suited for. So this is especially true, again, for ectotherms, but I would even push it towards plants and other kinds of even aquatic organisms as well. Other kinds of things that we have predicted and have come true and are very clear are basically three major factors. Distribution changes, right? Things moving to higher latitudes or higher elevations, phenologies, timing of events shifting ecologically. So things are happening earlier in seasonal habitats when things warm up quicker, for example, or when rains are delayed. So things can be delayed as well as become earlier. But the most important factor is the interaction of different species and that timing of that interaction becomes offset. And when they become offset, when one organism is responding to, for example, delayed rain by coming sooner and another is reacting to that same driver by coming later, then you're going to have this offset interaction, and maybe they won't even interact in an area or in an ecological relationship where they should be interacting. So distribution and phenology. And then the third one, this kind of third universal law, it's been called potential change in body size, is another reaction to, right, an impact of climate change as well. So really, if organisms can't move away, adapt, or deal with climate change in any other functional way, they will go extinct. Populations will go extinct. And if all the populations of a species go extinct, then of course, that entire species is going to be wiped off the planet. What I want to do is highlight now, I've kind of laid out some introductory kind of framework for you. And now what I'd like to do is give you a couple of examples of the problems that we have. And I think especially for scientists working with government agencies and thinking about the kinds of things that are going to be changing in the future, what we really, really need are fundamental, solid baseline studies. They're hard to do. They're long-term monitoring projects. They're hard to get funding for, but I'm talking to the right people. So hopefully I can convince you how critically important it is to already have these monitoring projects underway. And if you don't, then start them as soon as you can. So I was very fortunate to go into an area that was relatively undisturbed in 1995 to start my PhD in a part of Papua New Guinea that was kind of off the beaten track. It was a long-term monitoring project. I was working with local people, and I was fortunate. It wasn't so great at the time, but afterwards, I was very fortunate to be there before, during, and after an incredible El Nino Southern Oscillation event. So some of you in the audience might remember, if you were old enough to have lived through that situation, it was devastating for South and Southeast Asia. The drought of that period was the most extreme drought that had been historically ever recorded in the islands of Borneo, Sulawesi, and New Guinea. And what it revealed to me were some things that you could not have predicted unless you were there collecting the data. And these idiosyncrasies, I call them, about how our predictions or how just a logical ecologist in the field would have thought things would have been, and the departure from those kind of predictions is really incredibly important. And the most important part of this is the fact that you have to have this baseline. You have to know that you need to start a monitoring project before impacts, right? Before an event happens, to be able to determine the impact of that event. So I'm going to show you a little slide. What happened in that period between roughly August and January, August of 97 and January of 1998, was an extreme decrease. It was a drought in the island of New Guinea, where the normal leaf litter layer in the area that I worked in New Guinea gets 8 meters of rain a year. So it's like parts of Assam, incredibly high precipitation. The leaf litter layer was just a slimy little mat on the rainforest floor, like it is in a lot of rainforests. But during the drought, those leaves, when they fell, they volumized like potato chips, like crisps. They were all over the forest floor. Before, you were slipping and sliding. And during the drought, it was crunch, crunch, crunch. So it's really an extreme difference, even though it still was raining on average, a few millimeters of rain a day, just because of the intact canopy of the trees. But I'm going to draw your attention to a couple of graphs of data here. This is frogs that we saw per hour in a visual encounter survey. And these are frog calls per hour in it's a strip transect, an audio strip transect. And you can see they are slightly different. So what was interesting is during this period of very low rainfall, we actually saw more frogs. So not only more individual frogs per hour per sampling, standard sampling unit that we were doing, but we also found 3 new species that we hadn't seen before. And remember, a lot of this data was starting in 1995 and coming on through, but I just wanted to highlight this bump. It is statistically significant, and not only in the number of frogs per hour, but really importantly, we discovered 3 species for the first time. I'd been working there for almost 2 years, and I was studying frogs, and I thought I knew what I was doing. And then after the rains came back, those frogs disappeared. Interestingly, exactly what you would have predicted was happening with the frog calls. So these are their advertisement calls. These are frogs out in the forest doing what frogs do when they're usually happy. They call quite a bit, right? Over 100 calls per hour. So, you know, a couple every minute. During the drought, they were physiologically stressed, right? They were having a hard time. It wasn't as wet, and the frog call volume went down statistically as well. Now, what's really important and what I want you to think about is if you were a protected area manager, or you were working in the government and a drought was happening and you were telling your scientists, we better start to study the impacts of this really important event. So imagine you start your study as soon as the event happens, or right in the middle of the event, right? You've got, let's say, 40 frogs, 45 frogs an hour, and you've got 27 species that you see consistently. The event goes away, right? The rains come back, 3 species you never see again, and you get about a reduction in about half of the frogs. So what was happening, why we saw the higher number of frogs coming out during the drought, and why there were 3 new species, is because this is a visual encounter survey by, you know, people, bipeds, were on the ground walking around on trails in the forest. These were canopy frogs coming down from the canopy. It took me, you know, months to figure this out. And then when they disappeared, they were just going back up into the canopy. Of course, that's the part that dried out quickest during the drought. So they were coming down to ground layers closer to the ground to seek moisture. So it's not, you know, rocket science to figure that out, but imagine if you had started your study on the impacts of this major extreme event during the event, and then 3 species you never see again. You would clearly assume that they went extinct. You would clearly assume, because you're walking around and you never see them again. Why? Because they're in the trees. But if you're not sampling the trees, you wouldn't know that that's where they went. So I think it's critically important, because even a really conservative, really good data-based kind of an ecologist would make that assumption, right? Would make that prediction based on these data. So I think it's really incredibly important to be careful about these kinds of things that we automatically assume. And what's really important is to start these monitoring projects now. Start them before these major, you know, highly, you know, impactful extreme events happen. We have to have the data to know what is kind of baseline. It's a shifting baseline already, right? It's too late already, but it's better to start as soon as we can rather than forego any of these kinds of abilities that we have to compare what happened in the past with what's happening now and what could happen in the future. So I think that's our first take-home message is, if you're going to do some monitoring, and I highly recommend monitoring projects, it's got to be long-term and you got to start now. Don't wait until an extreme event. So another thing that was very interesting was some of the movement patterns. So distribution, right? That's the other thing that we know is going to change in a lot of organisms. They're going to be moving around in the environment, looking for that climate envelope, you know, their thermal niche, their moisture niche. Where is that going in the environment? It's probably going to be moving around as climates change and organisms respond to that. So we had an amazing opportunity. Now we're shifting from, you know, the biggest tropical island, New Guinea, we're shifting to Borneo, where I did a lot of work later on as a postdoc. We had an opportunity to compare what had been done, you know, almost a century before in 1929, a species list that was collected during actually a botanical expedition. And it was reported in 1931. We could go back to those same sites and compare any changes in the communities of frogs that we could see there. So we resurveyed the sites that they very carefully outlined on Mount Kinabalu. It was great, fantastic field work. I'd love to tell stories about that if I have a chance later. And so that's what we did. We couldn't use 2 of the sites because we weren't completely convinced that we had found the exact site that they had used. So we only used the 6 sites that we were very, very highly confident, like a cave, for example. That's where they slept and that's where they sampled the frogs. And what we found in this graph, here's the meters above sea levels. This is just an elevational graph. And each one of these lines is an individual frog species, right? And so this is their distribution in blue in the original 1929 fieldwork. And the red lines are the distribution in the years 2007 through 2011. So you can see we've got some different things going on at different elevations. In the lower elevations, it looks like almost all the species have been moving up, but that kind of flips around at the higher elevations where most of the species seem to be moving down. And then in the middle, they're kind of moving both ways. They're just moving around. Now, this yellow kind of band here, this bicolor yellow gold band here, I put in after the realization that it seemed like we had two effects. We had two things happening, one at high elevation and one at low elevation. So what was that middle elevation? What was going on there? Well, anybody that works in rainforests along an elevational climb knows that there's this thing called a cloud forest. And it's the limit of where clouds are kind of ever present, right? They do burn away, the winds blow them away, but this is a layer of clouds in the forest that's it's not permanent, but it's maintained. And it's one of these things where all the organisms in cloud forests, they're highly adapted to that kind of an environment. And what happens during climate change is these areas of cloud forest and the cloud banks themselves start to migrate up slope, right? They slowly but surely move up slope, and they shrink as well. So at the highest elevations, you don't get clouds all the time. And at the lower elevations, you don't get clouds all the time. It's this sweet little Cinderella spot right in the middle of Goldilocks. Sorry, I'm mixing my fairy tales. You get this middle elevation area where the clouds are, and that shrinks and slightly moves up. And it seems to be, again, we haven't published this. It's not preliminary data. These are real data, but we're having a hard time analyzing it. But it seems to be what's happening at the higher elevations are things are moving down. And what seems to be is at the low elevation, frogs are moving up. And this would not be the first time that we see this kind of differential movement, right? It's not like one rule, all organisms are moving up or all organisms are moving down. And what it really what helped me think about this was a paper in 2011 about plants and the normal distribution pattern shift that we see in organisms due to climate change is moving up slope, right? As things warm up, that same ecological kind of thermal niche is moving up slope. But if the organisms are more impacted or more heavily dependent on a limiting factor, for example, like precipitation, then they're going to be following the water. And if they have the capacity, the adaptive capacity, to be less impacted by the thermal regime, where they just have a slower or shorter growing season, and they can still eke out an existence, they'll follow the most important limiting factor. So in this case, Crimmins and colleagues showed that plant species are actually moving downhill, downslope, in response to finding a better kind of precipitation or a water balance. And we think the same things are probably happening for amphibians, because again, amphibians are really thermally and moisture dependent. It's kind of biphasic, right? Not only their lifestyle with tadpoles and eggs in the water largely, although in the tropics that shifts, but also about how they're responding to changes in the climate. All right, I don't have too much more time, so I'm going to zip through a few things. You guys know the relationship between metabolic rate and temperature, right? As temperature goes up, if you're a plant or an ectotherm, your metabolic rate goes up exponentially, right? It's a log scale there. And what's interesting is that we get this kind of decoupling of things that happen between temperature and metabolic rate at different kinds of latitudes. So in Mizoram, you guys, it's an interesting place. We're almost actually in Taipei, and you guys were almost at the same latitude, but you have a lot more elevation relief, and you've got some other things going on. But it's interesting to note that the change in temperature, right, is going to be greatest in places like the Arctic or the temperate zone, right, and a lot less in the tropics or the subtropics. But what happens is the change in metabolic rate is most seen, right, in the north temperate and tropical zones. Can you say where you guys are, right? And I think that this is really an important distinction, because even though it's kind of fair to middling the actual change in physical temperature in any given environment, what's really important and what's really impacting the organisms is this change in their metabolic rate. And this is because of the kinds of organisms that we find in these areas being already, perhaps in the tropics, like I showed before, already at the edge of their limit, or in the North Temperate Zone, the capacity of those organisms to speed up their metabolic rate during certain seasons is an incredibly important feature for them. So I just wanted to point that out, that it's not the same everywhere, and it's a little bit different than you might assume, being straight up one way in the Arctic and everybody else is not as bad. The actual increase in the change in the metabolic rate is incredibly important, exactly where you guys are. So if we're thinking about metabolism, so we're thinking about physiological energy budgets, right? Organisms have a certain amount of calories that they're going to be able to spend a certain kind of way. And there's really only three ways that they do this, right? They survive, right? It's like, that's the bare minimum. You gotta be able to maintain yourself, survive, just don't die. The next most important, and I say it's most important because really between reproduction and maintenance, surviving and reproducing, that's it, right? That's fitness. That's evolutionary fitness. Without those, your gene, your lineage, it's gone, right? So really the only kind of, what do you call that? Disposable budget. It's not disposable, but the only thing that they can really give up easily is the capacity to not pour as many calories into growth. So this is at the basis of this third kind of universal response to climate change. And that's what we think is a lot of organisms are shrinking. So we did a study a few years back, and fossils, experiments in labs, or comparative kind of experiments in the field, as well as very, very recent evidence, and all kinds of papers have cited our paper. Shrinking body size seems to be a really important response. And I think it's one of these aspects that we can easily study, right? You can easily study it because we've got specimens in herbaria and museums, right? If your museum hasn't burned down. Very, very sad situation in certain parts of India. I feel for you guys. But it is really a set of low-hanging fruits for a lot of scientists to start, especially a lot of students. This would be a perfect natural history museum kind of do some field-based work and some museum-based work, and just go back and basically think about how temperature might be impacting the ways that organisms are growing. So this is the kind of framework that we outlined about the different things that are happening with climate change, right? Precipitation, like I mentioned before, highly variable, can go up and down both ways. Temperature in general going up, and we know that with really good certainty. And then there are direct effects in different kinds of environments that we've talked about, like metabolic rate and respiration. They're going to go up with temperature. Developmental rates will speed up, and then both of those lead to, in general, smaller body-sized organisms as well. And then if you're in the water and you're an animal, you're going to need oxygen. And as water increases in temperature, it lowers its capacity to have oxygen be dissolved in it. And all of those things actually lead to smaller organisms at every layer or every hierarchical level in some kind of trophic structure. So I think it's really important because these things compound in the environment, not just one thing making one organism small, but many things making many organisms much smaller. And again, a great place to do these studies, to start these studies, is to get a good set of museum specimens and then go into the field. You don't necessarily need to collect more specimens, but at least get really good body size measurements from the field as well. And I'm not going to go over the data that we collected because I'm already getting close to being over time, but I just wanted to talk about assessing vulnerability of species and the kind of framework that we outlined in that 2019 paper with Wendy Foden as the lead author. And these are basically how to do different kinds of vulnerability assessments. And this is a combination of different methods that you can use. I can go into a question and answer session later and talk into more detail on those. But it basically enables really a smarter way of prioritizing what you're going to study and why you're studying it. And it allows governments, for example, or funding agencies to figure out where is more bang for the buck, right? Where can we spend the best money to get the most important work done? So I think identifying targets has a lot to do with who you have to be able to do the studies. You need experts. You need people that know these organisms inside and out. And then you need to do different kinds of climate change vulnerability assessments. But the most important thing, so this is a technical aspect, it's a scientific aspect, but this doesn't just, that's not the end. This isn't just an end in and of itself. You need to identify then what you're going to do with that information. If you determine that there are certain groups of organisms, for example, that are highly vulnerable, extremely vulnerable to climate change, then what do? Do you assist in migration? Do you create corridors between protected areas to help them do their own kind of distribution pattern shift? What kind of things can you identify as management options if those species are going to be important, or if the ecosystems and the kinds of services that you get, like watershed kind of protection, if those are going to be important for the communities around there? And then how are you going to implement those management options in the real world, right? And this is an iterative process, right? This is going to be again and again and again. You're going to have to monitor. And again, I cannot really highlight too much the fact of getting these monitoring projects going now if you haven't already got them. We have to know the distribution of species. We have to know where they are and how they're moving before we can figure out if we're going to target them for a vulnerability assessment, because we need to know so many things before you do a vulnerability assessment. So that odd ecology and the identification of targets is not an easy task in and of itself. All four of these quadrants actually are a PhD, right, in and of themselves. And then working together is really an interagency and multi-university and government kind of set of activities, I think. So I'm running out of time, and I respect your guys' time, so I want to finish up quick. I'm going to just go to a couple of definitions that are really important. Sensitivity and exposure and adaptive capacity. The adaptive capacity and sensitivity are things in and of themselves for each. It's what we used to call vulnerability to changes in the climate. What happened recently is we've shifted some of the different definitions. So we've taken this pink part, vulnerability, and put it over here as one of the three triads, and increased hazards, which is really this idea of extreme events. I think extreme events could be really important. Skip over that. So I'm going to talk a little bit in my last couple of slides about extremes. Understanding extreme events are way more important than just going out and collecting mean average temperature, mean average precipitation. So when you start your monitoring project, matters a lot, right? The baseline. I think that there aren't any simple answers anymore. I think that we're already in a world that's responding to climate change, and organisms are responding in different ways, right? They're sometimes doing things that we could not have predicted unless we were already out there collecting data. So first principles, I think it's, we're all biochemists at heart, we're all physicists at heart, but the biological changes that are happening, we need to think about why they're happening, going back to those first principles, going back to thermal ecology, going back to how important moisture is versus temperature for different kinds of organisms. I also think that we need to be collecting these data so that we know what a deviation from the norm is. Without having projects underway already, many times it's very risky to make assumptions about changes that you think have happened based on just the fact that you've started something during, for example, one of these extreme events. So I think that, the major problems in the world right now, like climate change, are the result of this difference between how nature really works and how people think about it, right? And I think that if I was going to, outline the kinds of things that I was asked to outline about what to do, the best ways to target your research in the future, I would say start now, right? You've got to already get those monitoring projects going, and you need to know the species that are going to be your target species. You need to know them. You need to have expertise on the ground so that if you do see changes, you can understand some of the reasons that those changes might be happening. That might not be just a clear-cut assumption that's really easy to predict before it happens. You need to be able to do these vulnerability assessments with real data. So a lot of people to thank in the course of collecting some of these data and some of these ideas, the way that they shifted through time. And I appreciate you guys and this opportunity to talk with you today as well. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. It was indeed an insightful presentation. For our next speaker, we have with us Dr. Boj Kumar Acharya, an associate professor and head in the Department of Zoology, Sikkim University. He completed his master's in zoology and has a PhD in biodiversity and ecology. His area of specialization is biodiversity and ecology. So I would now like to request Dr. Boj Kumar Acharya to give a presentation on the topic, Impact of Climate Change on Biodiversity, Insights from Sikkim, Darjeeling, Himalaya. Over to you, sir.
So, good morning to the organizers and all the participants. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
And hope my slide is also visible.
Yes, sir, it is.
So, thank you for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to be a part of this wonderful event. And it was a pleasure to listen to the talk of Dr. David Bickford. And as we know that he is an expert on the climate change, especially related to the herpetofauna. And today I'll be talking on some of the impacts of climate change and biodiversity with some examples from the Sikkim Darjeeling Himalaya. So let me confess here to the audience that I am not an expert like Dr. David in terms of climate change studies, but we have been doing studies on biodiversity in the region for the past almost 20 years or so. And today in this presentation, I'll be sharing some of the experience that we have gained during our studies, and then we try to link them with the effect of climate change. So my talk for today will be divided into two parts. So one, the first part is I just would like to give some glimpses of the latest IPCC assessment report that has been out very recently. And then I'll go back and then try to give some of the examples of how the biodiversity is being impacted due to climate change in this part of the world, that is Sikkim Darjeeling Himalaya. So this latest assessment report of the climate change is being released by the IPCC, and this report has highlighted some of the important issues. Some of the highlights are here, like this climate change are widespread, maybe because we might think that we are safe because we are in some locations where the biodiversity and forest is high. Maybe we might be thinking that way, but because the effects are global in nature, so it is widespread and it's very rapid because climate change is not a new issues. It has been happening since evolutionary time scale, but why we are worried is because the rate of change of temperature, the rate of change of the precipitation is very, very rapid, intensifying, and maybe we have not seen such kind of rapid changes in thousands of years. And as we know that there are multiple effects of the climate change on both the physical and biological world, as we have also witnessed in the presentation of Dr. David. So, but unless there are immediate and then rapid, and if we are able to reduce the greenhouse gases to a large extent, then maybe it is sometimes very difficult to limit the warming of the earth. And there are various projections which have been made by the IPCC that if we go by limiting the emission of greenhouse gases, then there may be a warming of only up to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And if we are able to achieve that, I think we shall be happy enough. But there are projections that the warming will be more higher than that. So it is not possible for us to go back and then maybe to correct what has already been done, but maybe we can slow down some of the effects, or maybe we can also limit some of the effects, and then maybe we can limit the warming. So this graph shows the cumulative carbon dioxide emissions between 1850 to 2019, and we can see here that the emissions were below 3,000 gigaton of carbon dioxide up to 2019. But since we have a different emission scenarios, and if we look into the lowest emission scenario, then the carbon dioxide emissions will be somewhere around 3,000 gigaton of carbon dioxide. But this is a very, very optimistic situation. But when you go into a very, very pessimistic situation where the shared socioeconomic pathways of 8.5, then the carbon emission might cross 4,000 gigaton, or maybe it might approach 4,500 gigatons of carbon dioxide. So if that is the situation, then warming will be very, very high, and it has been projected that the warming might be somewhere around more than 4 degrees centigrade by the end of this century. So this is the situation that we are facing currently. The current world is facing this kind of situation. And because of the increase in the greenhouse gases, because we are more focused on, there are many other greenhouse gases that cause the global warming. As we know, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, even water vapor. But we are more worried about the carbon dioxide is because the amount of carbon dioxide that is being released because of various activities are very high, and the atmospheric lifetime of the carbon dioxide is also very high. So because of the, and that is why there is a direct relationship between the release of carbon dioxide and then the increase in temperature that we all know. And if we look into these figures, then if there is a 1 degree rise in temperature, then definitely it will affect the land surfaces, the terrestrial surfaces more as compared to the aquatic surfaces, including oceans. And similarly, if there is these are some of the projections that have been made, because if the increase is 1.5 degrees centigrade, this would be the situation where we can see that the earth will be warming up by, if the earth warms up by 2 degrees centigrade, the effects will be more higher, or maybe if the earth warms up by 4 degrees centigrade, the effects will be more higher towards the higher latitude, especially in the Arctic and then the Antarctic region, the warming will be more. And as we know that most of the snow that occurs in these regions will be melted, and then we already have been listening about and then reading about the effects of the melting of glaciers, and then other effects that we might witness because of the melting of the glaciers. And similar trend we can see in the precipitation pattern also. And it has been expected that with the increase in the Earth's surface temperature, with the increase in the global warming, then the precipitation is projected to increase towards the higher latitude, and maybe in the equatorial Pacific, but it might decrease over the parts of subtropics. So it is simulated that the tropical region might be drier, or maybe the lower elevation region might be slightly drier as compared to the higher elevation region. So that is what is projected in the latest report. And similar with the case of the soil moisture, I'm not going into the detail of this. These reports are out and it is already available in the public domain. Now, as we look into the extreme events, then if we just consider the 10-year or 50-year event, then the likelihood of the extreme events are increasing. So if we see that if the rise in the temperature is 4 degrees centigrade, then there is a 39.2 times likely that the extreme events will occur. Maybe the flood intensity will increase, the rainfall intensity will increase, or maybe the hottest years will increase. So the extremities will are very likely with the increase in the temperature. So as we know that the effects of the global warming are widespread, but when we look into the data and then the predictions made by the IPCC, then we see that the mountain regions are more vulnerable. And it has been expected by the latest report of the IPCC that there may be a possibility that the temperature might increase from 3.3 to 5.7 degrees centigrade by the end of this century. And the mountains, I think, they possess the very vulnerable habitats, and then the biodiversity and the people of the mountains might be the worst affected because of the climate change. And mostly because we have just seen that the higher latitude or higher elevation areas are more impacted because the temperature is increasing at a rapid rate at these higher latitude or higher elevation, and then maybe it will impact the biodiversity of the higher latitude or the higher elevation regions. And the mountain tops has been described as a summit trap, because as we have also seen from the earlier presentations that the species are moving up. Maybe there are cases where the species are also moving down, but majority of the species are moving up. And it may be possible for the species which are occurring at the lower elevation, they might move up. But what will happen to the species which occurs at the mountain top? So either they have to tolerate the increasing temperature or the extreme events, or maybe they shall have to go into an extinction. So that is what is happening and expected to happen towards the mountain top. And because this climate change issues is quite new, and there are a lot of research that are happening in different parts of the world, but we do not have a very significant amount of research that has been undertaken in the Himalaya. So we don't know much about what is happening in the Himalaya. We have only preliminary information that is available from that. So if we look into the data across the world, then we have also seen from the previous presentation that there may be a modification in the species assemblages because some of the species are moving, some are moving at a lower rate, some are moving at a higher rate, some may not be moving, and some might go into an extinction. So there may be a modification in the species assemblages, there may be a changes in the species communities, there may be mismatches in the nutrient dynamics because the emergence of insects might be delayed when the predators are ready. And as we know that there may be an alteration of the species phenologies, the trees are flowering, fruiting maybe before their usual fruiting or flowering time. And we also have the cases of the shift of species ranges and niches. And we have already witnessed some of the extinction events. For example, this golden toad and many toads, especially from the tropical forest, have already been extinct, including this golden toad. So there are manifold effects that have been witnessed across the globe, and I think in the Himalaya also, that is what I think is expected. And I think the effect will be more in the Himalayas, mostly because the rate of warming of the Himalayan mountains are 3 times higher than the global average. And it has been still simulated that the rate of warming of the Himalayan mountains are 0.06 degrees centigrade per year. That means in the next 100 years, the warming will be at least 6 degrees centigrade, which is far more higher than the predicted for the entire globe. And some other studies have also highlighted that temperature in the Himalayas is rising at twice the average rate of warming in the northern hemisphere. So especially in the higher latitude, the warming is high. That is what we have witnessed. And then I think the Himalaya will be warming more than the northern hemisphere. And there are some figures that are available for the eastern Himalayas also, where the Sikkim and Mizoram and other states are located. So here also the increase in temperature is high, and it has been expected that minimum of 4 degrees centigrade for 100 years. So maybe by the end of this century, minimum 4 degree temperature rise we might witness, and there may be a cascading effects of this increase in temperature, as we know. And similar to what we have witnessed in the other parts of the world, the species in the Himalaya might tends to undergo range shifts. Maybe especially they might move towards higher elevation, and then the low elevation range might be restricted, and there may be an expansion. At the same time, there may be a contraction of the range sizes that might take place. And the major concern, especially in the Himalayas, are the shift of the tree lines and tree limits. The tree lines are moving up because of the melting of the glaciers and the formation of the meadow. The tree lines are shifting up. The tree limits are also shifting up, and consequently, there is a changes in the community structure and composition of different groups of organisms, whether they are plants or the animals. And as I have already highlighted, there may be a changes in the phenology, and there may be an increase in the competition because the resources are limited, and the congregation of the species will take place in the higher elevation, because the low elevation might not be very rewarding for the organisms to thrive there, and there may be an infestation of the invasive species that might occur. But as I mentioned, that the studies are very, very limited in the Himalaya, and more studies are needed to make the concrete conclusion. So here now I'll be sharing some of the examples based on some of the studies that have been undertaken in the Darjeeling Sikkim Himalaya, which is a part of the Eastern Himalaya. So there are a few studies that have highlighted that the plants are getting affected because of the increase in the temperature, or so-called the global warming. So the endemic plant species, especially in the Sikkim Himalaya, it has been shown to show the upward movement, and then it has been predicted that there is a displacement of around 27.5 meter per decade during the period of 1849 to 2010. So the endemic plants are moving up slowly. There is a displacement of the endemic plant communities, and the studies have also highlighted that during the period of almost 80 years, starting from 1923 to 2003, there was an upward shift of tree lines by 67 meter and tree limits by 45 meter. But if the increase in the temperature is towards the higher end, maybe as highlighted in my previous slide, if the increase in temperature is around 5 to 6 degrees centigrade, then I think the shift will be more rapid than the shift that we have witnessed in the past. And the studies have also highlighted that the endemic angiospermic plants might lose their potential habitat, most of this their potential habitat by the end of the century. And the data shows that around 16% of the endemic plants will be losing their potential habitat by 2050, and then around 18% of those plants will be losing their potential habitat by 2070. So these figures are quite scary. Similarly, the highlands are getting more affected, and during the period between 1990 to 2009, around 39% of the alpine meadows were converted into shrublands, because the shrubs that are there in the tree line areas, especially in the subalpine zones, they have been moving up, and then the alpine meadows, which is supposed to have only the herbaceous species, are being replaced by the shrubs. So there is a significant increase in the habitable areas of the shrubs in the alpine meadows, and they have been showing their expansion towards the northward, and the herbaceous communities of the alpine regions are being replaced. So and slowly, I think the herbaceous communities are moving towards the snow line, and the snows are getting melted, and meadows are being formed. But once all the snows are melted, then I think there will be a very difficult situation for these herbaceous communities to move further. So, and I think there are some predictions that have been made by the recent studies by some of the scientists from Delhi University, and it has been shown that maybe the meadows, the alpine meadows, will be losing their geographical extent. Maybe by 3% of the meadows will disappear by 2070 or so, and the herbaceous community will be losing their potential habitats, and maybe around 213 square kilometers of their current geographical area will be lost within the next 70 years. So if that happens, then maybe there will be the concomitant shift of other vegetation types, and maybe we'll not be able to see the alpine meadows in near future, and that is going to definitely alter the structure and function of the Himalayan highland ecosystem, because the Himalayan highland ecosystems are very unique kind of ecosystems, and we have different kinds of herbaceous species, especially the medicinal plants, and maybe those medicinal plants might go into an extinction, and which might endanger the life of the communities, not only living in the highlands, but also those communities who are dependent on the bioresources or other kind of resources, who are living on the low-lying areas. So this is what is expected, and some of the preliminary studies have highlighted on the highland areas in the Sikkim, Darjeeling, Himalaya. And this study, although which was conducted sometimes back in 2012, it shows that the rhododendron, which is one of the important plant species, also an indicatory species, which mostly occurs in the temperate to subalpine and alpine zone, they are losing the potential habitats. And the in the current situation, the 75 to 100% presence probability, these green dots will show the 75 to 100% occurrence probabilities. But with the changing climatic scenario, these higher probabilities presence habitats are getting lost. So we expect that the potential habitat of these rhododendrons also are declining very soon. And this is an indicatory species, and this might be true for many other species in the Himalayan region. And here I'll share some of the examples of the animal communities. So there are very unique mammalian species that occurs in the highland areas in the Sikkim, Darjeeling region, especially in the Sikkim region, and the high elevation areas of Sikkim shares the border with the Tibetan Plateau. And these mammal communities are very, very unique in that region. We find some of these very unique ungulates like the argali, the Tibetan gazelle. We have this southern kiang, or maybe these plosives, and they are highly adapted to this high elevation region, these alpine meadows. And but as we have witnessed in my previous slides, that the meadows are being replaced, the herbs of these meadows are being replaced by the shrubs, and then the temperatures are slowly increasing. So I think there may be a effect of this increasing temperature and the changing vegetation community to these ungulate communities in the region. So it has been highlighted that these mammals are the most vulnerable group in because their populations will be affected by the climate change, because they are the herbaceous communities, and then maybe if the herbs are not available, or maybe the temperature increases, then they may have a difficulty. And this Tibetan gazelle, or the populations of the southern Kiang, they are very unique to the northern part of Sikkim, and maybe I think they will experience the loss of habitats, and then maybe they will face some kind of ill effects of the climate change in near future. And it has been anticipated that because along with the increase in the temperature, there are increasing anthropogenic disturbances, and there are some other effects of including tourism and the other developmental activities. So the habitats of these very important mammals, I think, will be at stake, and we don't know what is going to happen in near future to these unique communities. Similarly, we have done some studies on the birds of the region, and we try to compare the recent data with the historical records, especially the birds of these regions were studied by Salim Ali during 1960s, and then we try to compare the elevational range limits of the data which was provided by Salim Ali almost 60 years ago, and then we try to compare the range limits of elevation range limits of these birds, and we have found that many of the bird species, at least 25 bird species, have shown the shift in their elevational ranges, and the majority of them have shifted towards the lower elevation range is shifting more as compared to the higher elevation range. And we have found that some of the species have shifted quite high. Maybe this blood fusion during the time of the during the expedition by Salim Ali during 1960s, this bird was found as low as around 1500 meter, but we find them above 2500 meter only now in recent years. Similarly, this grandala were recorded towards up to the mid elevation during those days, but it has been recorded only above 3000 meter during the recent years. And these are some of the examples of the bird species where we have noticed, as compared to the previous records, that their upper range limits are the lower elevation range limits are higher as compared to the historical records. Apart from that, I think there is a altered seasonality in the breeding of birds, and in many cases, what we have studied in other parts of the world is that there is a change in the breeding pattern, and the breeding is being advanced. But what we noticed in the case of Sikkim is that in some of the bird species, there is a delay in the breeding activities. Either it is habitat selection or nest building, or maybe laying of eggs has been delayed in some of the species. For example, this white collar blackbird is a temperate species, and normally it starts breeding somewhere during the month of March. But we have seen that the breeding is delayed by a month or so, and it starts breeding by the end of April, or maybe by the mid of May. And similar with other species of birds that I have shown here. So maybe because the birds needs some kind of first rain to induce the breeding activities, and I think there is a change in the rainfall pattern, and maybe because of the change in the rainfall pattern, their breeding seasonality might have been changed. Similarly, we have also noticed this kind of delayed activities in the habitat selection or nest building, or maybe laying of eggs and emergence of hatchlings in some of these subtropical or temperate species. For example, this white-capped water registrat is a very widely spread species. It occurs almost from the lower elevation, somewhere around 3,000 meter, it goes up to 5,000 meter or so. But during the breeding season, it moves up and then it breeds in the temperate region. And this is also an undergrowth species in the temperate region. And we have seen that there is a delay in the breeding activities. So if the breeding activities are delayed, then maybe by the time when the hatchlings are there in the nest, and the food may not be available for them, because the especially when the birds breed, then they coincide with the availability of the food item, especially the emergence of insects. And maybe because if there is no synchronicity of the emergence of insects and the breeding of birds, and maybe there may be a failure of the breeding, or maybe the hatchlings may not be energetic enough to survive and thrive. So this is what I think we just expected based on our preliminary observation. And apart from that, we also observed there is a reduction in the clutch size. The number of eggs that have been laid by the birds are lesser as compared to the previous records. We have noticed in this kind of reduction in the clutch sizes in some of the species. For example, chestnut crowned laughing thrush, the picture that I have just shown in my previous slide, which is a undergrowth species in the temperate forest, the grayback shrike, and this white rump munia, which is a lower elevation species, which occurs mostly in the agricultural areas, where we have seen that there is a reduction in the clutch size. So maybe because there are indirect effects of the climate. Directly, they may not be affected by the climate change, but because, as I just mentioned, that the food availability may not be appropriately may not be available in an appropriate time, and that could be the reason the clutch sizes are being reduced. And there may be we also notice that either there is a low reproductive success or breeding failure in some of the high elevation species. And Sikkim comprises of many high elevation wetlands where many body species comes, and then many of them come for breeding. These are some of the examples, like this Brahmini dog. We also call it as a reddish-tailed dog, and there are records of their breeding during the time of Salim Ali. But there are no breeding records that have been available in recent years. So we presume that the failure in the breeding or failure in the reduction in the population size might be linked to increasing water temperature during the breeding season. That could be one of the reasons, but it needs further exploration. And this is the study which was carried out recently by some of our colleagues in Sikkim on one of the regions, this Satire tragopan, and it has been shown that with the different climate change scenarios in the year, and it has been predicted that the switchable habitat of the Satire tragopan will be lost by 2050 or so, especially in the high to mid elevation in the Himalayan region. So we see that this is the case when the situation is optimistic, when during the case of the RCP 2.6, when the emissions are lesser, but when the emissions are higher, when the situation is RCP 8.5, when the emissions are at a higher end, then there is a possibility that most of the switchable habitat of this bird will be lost. And the study have also highlighted that most of the habitat of the switchable habitat of this Satire tragopan, which is one of the indicator species of the pheasant, it falls outside the protected areas. So it also highlights that whether our protected areas are strong enough to conserve the habitat of this kind of indicatory species. And recently, we have done some of the simulation studies of two body species, this blue whistling thrush and then the white-capped water reddish-tailed. Although they are not the aquatic birds, they are water-dependent birds, and their distribution is mostly near to the water bodies. And if you look into these maps, so the presence, the presence of these birds is towards the water bodies, because these are the major water bodies of the region, and this is a Tista River and Tista basins that we see. So their distribution is coinciding with the water bodies, and similar with the case of the white-capped water lily. But as we know that because of the increasing temperature, or because of the global warming or climate change effect, the springs are drying, and the government of Sikkim has carried out an extensive study here in Sikkim, and it has been noticed that majority of the springs are drying. And what happens if the spring dries? What happens to the population of these birds? Definitely their habitats will be thinning. So this kind of situations I think we are expecting in the near future. Similarly, there are effects on the different groups of other organisms. For example, we have seen the elevational range shift of some of the herpetofaunal species. There was a upward migration of the cobra, both the king cobra and then the monocelate cobra. So we normally this species occurs in the tropical to subtropical region, but this snake was recorded somewhere around 2,000 meters in Sikkim, and this king cobra was recorded around 3,000 meters. So it clearly indicates that species are moving up. Similarly, some other snakes, these snakes normally occurs at much lower elevation, somewhere around 18,000 meters to 2,000 meters. But we have recorded these snakes towards a higher elevation. This Empisma platyceps at 2,600 meters, and then this Trachestium guntheri somewhere around 3,000 meters or so. So it indicates that the herpetofauna are responding to the increasing temperature. Similarly, these amphibians are also moving up. Some of the amphibians, for example, this Scutigera sikkimensis, which is a high elevation toad, which is also showing an extension in its upper elevation range. And as I just mentioned, that the springs are drying, and maybe especially in the lower elevation regions, some of these springs are, the perennial springs are getting dried, as you can see here in the picture. So if this drying of springs are also affecting majority of the amphibian populations, so some of these amphibian populations are shown here, which are being affected because of the drying of these water bodies. And in contrast to the breeding pattern, as we have seen in the case of the birds, I think that there is an advancement in the breeding in the amphibians in Sikkim. Is some frogs and toads. We have noticed that their breeding season has been advanced by a month or so, maybe because again there are infrequent rains, and I think the amphibians are not able to notice whether the monsoon has really started or not, and I think they advance their breeding, and maybe sometimes if there is a dry spell in between, then there may be a breeding failure as well, leading to population decline. And we also noticed a very interesting phenomenon in one of the snakes species here in Sikkim. This is a Trachestium guntheri, which is a communally breeding snake. And we found that there is the sex ratio of these snakes is highly skewed. Normally, based on the feces ratio, the sex ratio is normally 1:1. Maybe there is it is not perfect, but it is expected. But we found that the number of females are far more higher as compared to the number of males. And there are theories, especially in ecology, that the determination of the sex will be determined by the temperature in the case of the reptiles, and there are a lot of studies that have been undertaken, and the warmer temperature will favor females. So we just would like to put forward here is the highly skewed sex ratio of in the case of these snakes could be because of the increasing temperature. So there are possibilities for further research in these areas as well. And The amphibians, there is a recent study on the habitat switchability of the amphibians, especially the scutiger group of frogs in the Himalaya, and it has been shown that the switchable habitat during the current time might become highly unswitchable. These red dots, what is shown here in the map, are the habitats that might become unswitchable for the scutiger species in by the end of this century, or maybe 50 years down the line. Most of the habitats which are switchable for these frogs now might become unswitchable during that time. And similarly, other groups of organisms are also responding to the climate change. We notice that some of the butterflies are also shifting their ranges towards higher elevation. I have shown some of the species here, but we noticed that around 30 species have already responded to the increasing temperature, and they have been shifting their ranges towards higher elevation. So that is going to affect their survival, because they are highly dependent on the nectar plants, they are highly dependent on the larval host plant, and although the butterfly might shift, but the plants may not be shifting at the same rate as the butterfly shift. So there may be some other effects that might lead into the population crash. And there are studies on the medicinal plants also. Here is one example of one of the medicinal plants known as a Ophiocordyceps sinensis, which occurs in high elevation areas in Sikkim and other parts of Eastern Himalayas, including Bhutan. And it has been estimated that the switchable habitat of this medicinal plant is also getting affected, and in the near future these medicinal plants also will lose a lot of its habitat. And again, in the same study, it has been found that with the increasing temperature, maybe to some extent the switchable habitat might increase, but with the further increase in the temperature, again the potential habitat of this species also again will be impacted or affected. And again, I emphasize here that these are the preliminary studies and needs further elaboration. And there are again some vulnerability studies that have been undertaken in the Eastern Himalayas, and I found these papers that was published in 2018, and here the authors have tried to estimate the vulnerability of different components, like the vulnerability of biodiversity, and we can see that biodiversity of the region is most of the regions in the Eastern Himalaya, the vulnerability is more than 0.4. Similarly, there is a vulnerability, there is a high vulnerability in the water, and as compared to all these 4 components that have been assessed here, biodiversity, water, ecosystem, and human well-being, I think the ecosystems at large is highly vulnerable as compared to the other components. And here is the picture of the different protected areas located in the Eastern Himalayas, and there are, I think, somewhere around 91 protected areas that occurs in the Eastern Himalayan region, and some of these protected areas are also have a high vulnerability of some of the protected areas are more than 0.6. And I think the communities are also aware, and this picture shows that how community perceives the climate change in the region. And based on the people's perception, it has been estimated that the farming and pastoral communities will be the most impacted due to the climate change, followed by biodiversity and lowland and plain communities, and then the children and businessmen. Similarly, the people have perceived that changes in weather patterns will be the most important factors, which will be the which will be very evident because of the climate change, and it will also impact the biodiversity. And people have also, I think, noticed that there are frequent disasters and drying of water resources. I think this is one of the major concerns. And we have here one important program in Sikkim known as the Dharavikas Program, where I think the government of Sikkim, the Rural Management Department, in collaboration with some of the organizations here in Sikkim and in other parts of India, and they have mapped around 700 streams, and it has been found that majority of these streams are drying up, and there is a revival program that has been happening. And these are some of the adaptation strategies that have been suggested by the people. So awareness, I think, and preparedness is one of the important aspects for the adaptation strategies. And this table shows the vulnerability index of the different parts of the Eastern Himalaya, especially within the Kanchenjunga landscape. And it has been found that the Darjeeling is more vulnerable as compared to Sikkim, Nepal, and Bhutan. So if we go by the vulnerability index, then Darjeeling is more vulnerable as compared to Nepal and Bhutan. So that means Sikkim and Darjeeling Himalaya is more vulnerable than the Nepal, which is located in the western part, and Bhutan, which is located in the eastern part. And these are some of the protected areas that are located in the region, and the protected areas located in Darjeeling and Sikkim are more vulnerable as compared to the protected areas, with some of the protected areas which are located in Nepal and Bhutan. So it shows that the regions is quite vulnerable, and I think some of the interventions are very important in order to mitigate the effect of the climate change. So I just come to the end of my presentation, and we know that there are clear trend of rise in temperature and variability along the elevation range in the Darjeeling, Sikkim, Himalaya, and the data shows that the Himalayan mountains are warming at a far more higher rate as compared to the northern hemisphere or the global average, and there are reduction in the precipitations, or the extreme events are more, and the rainfall months have decreased, but the intensity of rain have been increased, and the winters are becoming more warmer compared to the past. And there are estimation that maybe by the end of this century, around 90% of the endemic species of the plants and animals will be lost from the Himalayan region. And we have also seen that there is a shift in the habitats towards higher latitude and higher altitude, and alpine habitat will be the most impacted one because it will be encroached by the shrubs, impacting the other animal communities, including mammals. So, and there are increasing anthropogenic pressures, which we witness here in this part of the world. There are so many hydropower projects that have been commissioned here, and a lot of developmental activities are happening. Deforestation is ongoing, urbanization is very high, and tourism is one of the biggest industry here in this part of the world. So all these effects coupled with and contributes to the climate change, I think, and unless we do we intervene and try to reduce some of these anthropogenic pressures, I think the effect will be very high in the near future. For example, the density of the hydropower projects is largest in Sikkim in the entire Asia. We already have more than 30 power projects that are there in Sikkim. So if we go by density, the hydropower projects are very, very high, and which is not only impacting the streams, but also impacting the nearby forest, and also the people which are living in those areas. And I think the protected areas are also not adequate in the context of climate change, because there are a lot of predictions that the protected areas that occur in the region, I think they will not be able to fulfill or they will not be able to protect some of the vulnerable species that occurs. So, so I think there are a lot of things that is to be taken care of in near future in order to mitigate the ill effect of the climate change. So what we need to do is that I think there are no systematic research in the Himalaya. There are few research that are there, sporadic research that have been conducted, but long-term monitoring research that we have seen in the previous presentation, such kind of extensive research are not available in the Himalaya, and it is high time that these studies are to be initiated. And I think most of the Himalayan regions are shares the international border, and I think we need to manage them looking into transboundary approach. And some of the transboundary approaches are already examples are available. For example, there is a transboundary initiative known as the Kanchenjunga Landscape Conservation and Development Initiative that has been initiated by the ICMOD Kathmandu, Nepal. There is a Kailas Sacred Landscape Initiative, and there is a Far East Himalaya Initiative. So these transboundary initiatives are needed, and then maybe because the effects are not local, the effects and then the causes are also regional or maybe at the global level. And I think establishment of the more protected areas are not possible, but maybe I think the extension of the boundaries of the protected areas are very important, especially in the transboundary landscape, or maybe we shall have to go into the concept of land sharing approach, because we may not be able to spare the land for the protected areas, but whatever land that is available outside the protected areas, I think we need to prioritize it for the biodiversity conservation and protection of the water resources. And I think communities are very, very important. And the mountain communities are very important, not only for the mountains, but also for the people who lives in the low-lying areas. So mountain people should be made aware. They should be made, they should be more responsible, I think, and more participation of the mountain people is very, very important. And I think the attitude of the people is very, very important. And I think we always wanted to have the sophisticated life. We do not want to live outside the world of AC or any other. I think the comfort. So I think we should have the change in the attitude in order to mitigate the effect of climate change. Unless there is a change in the attitude of individual people, I think the effect of climate change cannot be minimized. So with this, I end my presentation here, and I'd like to express my gratefulness to the Mizoram Science, Technology and Innovation Council of IJOL for giving me this opportunity to be a part of this event. My special thanks to Engineer H. Lal Shaumiliana, who is a Chief Scientific Officer and Member Secretary of MISTIC, and of course, I thank Sikkim University and my research team there in the department. I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Vasundhara Chhetri for helping me with this presentation. And I also would like to thank all the participants for your patient hearing. So thank you so much. I end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for sharing us with your research work. It was indeed an extremely interesting presentation. Before we move on to the interaction session, I would like to point out that there is a link in the chat box. Please click on the link for the filling out the details for the e-certificate. Then we'll start our interaction session. The participants are free to ask our resource persons any question or query that they may have, or they can type in the chat box. We have first question from Dr. Vasundhara Chhetri. Ma'am, would you like to ask the question yourself, or I can just read out your questions from the chat box?
Thank you so much. My question is to Dr. David Bickford. It was indeed a very interesting talk, as I also work on the herpetofauna. Sir, you said that there is a body size shrinkage due to the climate change. So does that mean that larger bodied organisms are more vulnerable to climate change?
That's an excellent question. Thank you very much, Ms. Chetri. I think it doesn't necessarily mean that larger organisms are more vulnerable per se. I think that our ability to detect change in body size is heightened for larger body-sized organisms in general. So there might be a bias about our ability to detect which species are changing in body size already. So always got to think about, these inherent biases about our measurements and the kinds of ways that uncertainty kind of creeps into some of these ways that we think the world works, right? So not necessarily is the best answer to that question, but you're totally onto something. I think there's going to be, not every organism is going to be shrinking. Some organisms are going to do fine, right? Some organisms are going to even benefit from impacts of climate change. What we saw in Mount Kinabalu is species are moving up and down, right? So you're getting new interactions of species that might not have ever interacted, like evolutionarily. They might have never been in the same community of organisms sharing that, stream space. But now these new kinds of interactions are going to happen. So if an organism is inherently already larger, it might not shrink. It might do better because it's out competing some of the other organisms that now it's in a new community with. And so those other organisms might be shrinking more because they can't eat enough or whatever else is going on, right? So I think in so many of these communities, it's too complex to actually say this is always going to be the way that it is. I think your question is spot on. Like that would be one of the hypotheses, right? To try to test and see if that would work. But definitely, I don't think that we can assume that that's the case. Good question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your insights. Yes, it will be, I think, a great query to look into in the future research. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, organizer. It was a wonderful event to listen to both the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. If there's any other questions, we'll still open the interaction session. Our resource persons can also share some comments if they like. If they can add some more comments if they want. So I think there are no more questions from the participants. Dr. David, if you would like to have any more comments, say any more comments.
I don't have anything too much else to say, except I think that, now is a perfect time to be having interactions like this. And I hope that people, I didn't share my email, but I'll put it in the chat buffer. If anyone wants to get in touch or has any questions, certainly about your own research or about the kinds of things that I might be able to help with, I can certainly offer advice, but I think that now's the time to get those monitoring projects going, like Dr. Acharya was talking about. Like there's so many things happening right now. I think it's a perfect time for this kind of a situation to be happening and us to be talking about impacts on biodiversity and how to figure out what's happening.
Okay, thank you, Dr. David. Dr. Acharya, do you have any more comments?
Yeah, thank you. I do not have much comments, but as I highlighted in my presentations, that I think the research in this part of the world is very minimum, and it was my pleasure to be here in this program sharing with Dr. David Bigford. So I request Dr. David to maybe guide us in some of the future research program, so that I think we can also take forward some of the quantitative studies. I think the way that you are doing in Papua New Guinea and other parts of the world, I think such kind of the extensive well-planned studies, quantitative studies are needed to understand the exact effect of the climate change. Whatever I say today are some of the preliminary observations that we have. I think based on these preliminary observations, of course, the preliminary observations are very important, But based on these observations, I think the quantitative data are very, very important in order to infer what exactly is happening to the biodiversity and the physical world of the mountains. So we'll be very happy to receive the help and support from Dr. Devi. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more question from Professor H. Ramsanga. Professor, do you want to ask the question yourself, or I will just read out the questions from the chat box?
Yeah, question is there for whom? This question is for me?
Professor H. Ramsanga. Are you there?
I can see the question, but this question is for me or for Dr. David? I think it is for me. So yeah, I can see the question from Professor S.T. Lal Rem Sangha. How do company and state government are getting environmental clearance? Who are conducting assessment? As we know that construction of dam, hydropower, roads building are responsible for climate change, forest improvement. Definitely the EIA is being conducted, as you know, but you know that in the Indian scenario, how the EIAs are being conducted, I think I need not emphasize on that. So I think the participation is less, and I think some of the concerns of the communities are goes unheard and unnoticed. And you know that in Sikkim, especially, there is a place called Jongu, which is known as a reserve for one of the indigenous tribe known as Lepchas. So the government wanted to implement construct 2 dams there, and people do not want the dams to come to their location, and they really objected to it. And at some point of time, they went for a hunger strike for almost more than 2 months. But still, I think the dams could not be stopped. So I think there are processes that are there in the government sector, but I think the communities are not strengthened that way so that their voices are heard. So I think that is to be taken care of, and then I think the voices of the local communities should be heard by the authorities. Otherwise, all formalities are being done. Without EIA clearance, no dams, no roads, nothing is being happening. But whether the voices of the communities are heard or not, I think that is a question. I think you agree with me, Professor Lal Sangha. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. If there are no more questions, I think we can move on to the next program. I would like to call Mr. Lethan Puya, Project Scientist 2, State Climate Change Cell Mystic, to give the vote of thanks.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Didini. First of all, it is our wish to organize this event offline mode, somewhere nice where we could have proper interactions face to face. But due to this global pandemic COVID-19 problem, which we also face seriously in Mizoram, so we could not do that. Maybe it's a better convenience for us to organize like this. So I hope it is sufficient information for all the participants. And secondly, we are talking about climate change here today. So it has been raining here itself since this morning. We've got a slight sprinkler around 9:30 a.m. in the morning, and then it has been raining quite heavily during Dr. Acharya's presentation also, which is very not normal even for our case, because mostly during January, December, we don't have much rain. Even if we do, we have a slight drizzle, something like that, but it has been raining heavily since the past December. Also, we have quite heavy rain, and then last year also it was not raining properly. So I'm not going to much details of that, but we know that climate is changing even here in the state of Mizoram also. So I will go to the my purpose of this program. First of all, I would like to thank the Climate Change Program Division of Department of Science and Technology, Government of India. With their support, the State Climate Change Cell of Mizoram can exist. And secondly, I would like to point out our nodal officer climate change for the state of Mizoram, which who is also the additional PCCF of Department of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. I would like to point out to their government that thank them that they put their trust towards the State Climate Change Cell to take responsibility of the leading role as a technology partner for the State Climate Change Program of Mizoram. And I would also like to thank our Chief Scientific Officer, Engineer H.L. Somliana, and our co-PI, who is Mr. Samuel Almalsoma, Senior Scientific Officer of MISTIC. With their support, we can organize this program. And our resource person, Dr. David Bickford and Dr. Boch Acharya. You know, I have, when we tried to organize this program around a month back, we were just randomly searching for some probable resource person for this purpose. And then we looked for some papers, and then I found on ResearchGate that Dr. Bickford, some papers were listed. So I took my chance and then just leave him a message that whether he could be a resource person for this program. And surprisingly, he replied to us. So we are very happy that he can reschedule his very busy time, give time to us, and then give a very insightful presentation today. And second, Dr. Acharya, also he was listed, means if you talk about climate change and research, Sikkim, I think that we can safely say that Sikkim is the hub for those kind of research in India. So I contacted some of my friends from Sikkim, and then I asked who will be the probable person, best person. So they told me that Dr. Acharya will be the best suitable person for this job. So we thank him again for giving his time and delivering his valuable presentation to us. And last but not the least, I want to thank all the participants here, faculties, researchers, students from different colleges and universities. Without them, this program will not be successful. So, and different participants of representative from non-governmental scientific organizations in the state of Mizoram. And my colleagues from State Climate Change Cell, our host, Dr. H. Laldin Pui, and our colleagues from MISTIC, who were giving us their support and help for every kind of need we have. I thank them. And lastly, I want to stress that I want to apologize for any irregularities or inefficiency on our part to organize this event. And I wish very good day to you all. Thank you. Didini, please unmute yourself. Yes.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Ratanpriya. And with that, we have come to the end of the program. Stay safe, everyone, and a very good afternoon to you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye and namaste to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.